Alright guys, my name is Helmi and today we're going to do a continuation of the last video, which was regarding 1933 to 1938 Germany. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that the map is already drawn, but the reason I did this is so we can save time and make the video as entertaining as possible, because otherwise you're just going to watch me draw a map, which I know you guys enjoy, but in this video I want to try something different. And the idea is to draw, well, the changes. So we're going to do from 1938 until 1941, so until the invasion of Russia, and then I will also show the beginning of the invasion of Russia. Now, one thing you'll notice is I added Belarus and Ukraine. They are not independent, they are SSRs. So SSRs were basically the equivalent of provinces within the USSR. Let me just take some water. Perfect. So, on the last episode, what we ended up with was the German situation with the Sudetenland. Now, they had just taken the Sudetenland and, well, as you can expect, Mustache Man wasn't appeased by this. He wanted more. He wanted much more. Now, personally, if I was him, I would have ended it here. You have basically all the Germans, and you might say that no, there are more Germans elsewhere. The only other part of the world where I could consider it as German is Danzig, but Danzig was a free city. If you think about it, Germany had all the Germans that it needed. Now you could justify it saying there's a bunch of minorities in the east, but it's not enough for you to invade a country. Russia is doing that today. Now, what happened is, well, after the conference, which I believe is the Munich conference, where Neville Chamberlain said peace in our time, what happened instead is there was no peace in our time. In fact, it was a piece of land that Mustache Man took, and peace. So what happened is, well, they invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, and one of the ways that it was facilitated is through a man in Slovakia named Tiso. This man, as soon as the Germans said they were going to invade, and they invaded, he declared a coup d'etat, resulting in Slovakia leaving, well, Czechoslovakia. And then, soon afterwards, the Hungarians would invade afterwards. But they did not invade directly, so I know a lot of you play Hearts of Iron 4, but what happened is Carpathia-Ruthenia became independent temporarily. Now, I saw an alternate history video where they said, what if Germany won World War II? And one of the ideas was Germany helping the Carpathians instead of giving them instantly to the Hungarians. Because giving it to Hungary, what happened is the Ukrainians became unhappy and they were much less favorable, even though in real life a lot of people say, Ukrainians were happy to see Germans come. But that did not last long. Now, if they had made a Carpathian puppet, that would mean that the Germans could easily justify saying that we love Ukrainians and hence more support. Now, eventually they invade, so we're just going to erase this. And this leads to the partition of Czechoslovakia. And I'm not going to erase the borders here because there was a Reichsprotectorate that was established later on, so we'll just keep it there. Now, at this situation, you are left with, well, the eve of World War II. So what happened is, well, he was not pleased with what he had taken. By the way, don't forget, the Polish also invaded and took Zabolzi. I believe I explained that in the last video. And now you are faced with a situation where, well, he wants to invade more countries. Now he wanted Poland. Now, a common misconception that a lot of people justify this is all Germany wanted was a little connection, right? That was his demand, apparently. Now, Germany had invaded without even caring about the result of this right away. And the Polish did not want to respond because they did not even believe it. Now, then there was a bunch of false flag operations on the border. The radio tower, I believe, that was attacked supposedly by Polish people. Instead, it was just Germans dressed up as Polish soldiers. And then you have, well, World War II begins. So Germany demands the corridor, supposedly, which they didn't really demand. And then, well, the Germans decide to invade without telling anybody. So there was two army groups. There was Army Group North and Army Group South. And don't forget, the USSR and Germany have a pact now. So before they invade, they sign a secret treaty. So you have Army Group South, led by Rundstedt, and then you have Army Group North, led by Feder von Bock. These two armies, they invade, and they cut the two army groups, they use a new tactic called the Blitz, or the Blitzkrieg, which is basically lightning warfare. So at this situation, you have, I'm just gonna erase these, you have slow advances, they go from here, from here, and then you have the encirclement of Gdynia, where there was a staunch Polish resistance. And eventually, well, Warsaw gets cut off, and the Polish army is unable to escape, except for a few soldiers who escape into Romania. But it was not enough. And then the Russians invade, which the Polish soldiers thought that Russia was coming to help them. They were dead wrong. And eventually you lead to the partition of Poland. So you have these borders. So we're just gonna draw these borders, and then we're gonna draw the borders of the Reichskommissariat of the general government. So eventually you have this, and then you have Reichskommissariat borders of the general government. So it looks like this, and the Germans annex this area too, which was historically German, and also the memo, which eventually returns to Germany through Germany enforcing it, and the Russians basically take, well, the rest of it. We take Eastern Poland. And this leads to, well, the partition of Poland, and where all the memes come from. Now you're faced with, well, Germany that has just invaded Poland. Now, by the way, during the invasion of Poland had asked France to invade the Germany through the Saarland. Now this, you might not know this, but apparently the French had done an actual offensive, and they had pushed basically this. And as soon as Poland fell, the French pulled back to the Maginot Line. So it was basically, I did something. And by the way, there was only around 100 to 200,000 German troops on the French border, maybe even less. And none of them were motorized or tanks. All of their tanks were in Poland. You might think that the Germans were, doing this whole modern warfare, but half of their so-called motorized were actually horse-drawn. In fact, not even half, maybe even more than half. A lot of people have this misconception that Germany was highly mechanized and everything, but no, it's because they knew how to concentrate all of them into one area to make it seem like it is, but on all other fronts, there was basically nothing. Now, after this, the Germans decide, well, this is when the phony war begins. So basically nothing happens. So, hold on, I forgot to draw. But you can see the San Marino. Now this begins the phony war. So nothing happens. The British decide to launch an air expedition to Germany, and all they sent was leaflets. And apparently this common rumor came around saying that, well, the British basically gave Germany a bunch of toilet paper. Now, we are faced with a situation where, hold up, I also forgot another thing. Okay. Now we are faced with a situation where, well, nothing is happening, and the Germans finally in 1940, so we're gonna pass a year, in 1940 they decide, well, before we invade the West, we need to secure our iron exports to Sweden. Because the British were doing a blockade, and they knew that if the British got into Norway, then they would lose their iron exports. So what does Germany do? They invade Denmark and they invade Norway under Operation Weserbrunn. Honestly, I don't know. You can search it up. I can't pronounce that. So eventually they do invade Denmark, they invade Norway, and this leads to Denmark collapsing in 6 hours. Yes, that is true. And Norway took a little bit longer. They invaded, and also Norway did not collapse until late 1940, even early 1941. France collapsed actually before Norway, because Norway was resisting all the way to the top. Now, we are coming to the more interesting field, which is the Western Theater. Now, what is so interesting about the Western Theater? Well, that is where the infamous encirclement of Dunkirk came around. Now, how did this happen? How did this work? What happened is a German spy plane crashed in Belgium with their plans. This forced the Germans to redraw their plans, and this forced Mustache Man to actually make the plans himself alongside Erich von Manstein. Now, let me tell you something. A lot of you guys might think, oh, if Mustache Man gave more control to his generals, then maybe they would have won. If Mustache Man had given control to his generals during invasion of France, France might have actually lived, because the Germans, especially the generals, thought that it will be a repeat of World War I, that they had to be strategic and slow. But Mustache Man thought of it more as, we gotta destroy them quickly. And that is exactly what happened. So when the Germans invaded, well, they invaded through the Ardennes forest. Now, the Ardennes offensive was supposed to be much slower, but Heinz Guderian decided, screw it, I'm gonna keep going forward. And it's what happened exactly. So he decided to invade. I'm gonna remove the arrow. He decides to invade. And eventually he reaches here, and then the rest of the German forces are all here, and then the Dutch surrender because they were threatened to be destroyed, and they did not want Amsterdam to be destroyed. Then we're arriving here. Now, mind you, historically, French forces in real life were considering to do an offensive here. In fact, Winston Churchill had begged them to do it, but the French decided not to. And what did this result in? They slowly pushed towards Dunkirk, and most of Belgium had collapsed by then, so let's just erase that. Not erasing too much, because we're going to draw the right commissariat afterwards. So this is what had happened by then. And by then, this is what it looked like. The Dutch had collapsed eventually. They did have some resistance, but the Dutch had surrendered. And now you had the British and French forces encircled in Dunkirk. The French forces were all captured, well, most of them, but the British managed to escape. Now, mind you, the encirclement of Dunkirk, as a failure as it was for the Germans, because they didn't get to destroy everything, it was also a massive success, because the entire British stockpile was left behind, and the French stockpile as well. What does this mean? Is that when later on, when they invade Russia, a lot of the German heavy equipment was French and Czech and British. They weren't all German made, which is another misconception. So eventually the French are destroyed here, the British are destroyed, and eventually the Germans keep pushing, they reach all the way to Paris. Paris surrenders without a fight because they didn't want Paris to be destroyed. And eventually the armistice is signed at Compiègne. And this is where Vichy France is declared. There we go. And with Vichy France declared, the Germans also annex directly Alsace-Lorraine because they deem it as German. Right? So with the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, they also declare a settlement zone. So supposedly that's what it's called. This settlement zone, which is also a demilitarized zone, well, for after the war. But they declared as in the armistice that this would be a demilitarized zone, but it was also a settlement zone. This was called the military administration of France because technically it was occupied France. So after the war, technically, it would return to Vichy France. But let's be honest, if the war had ended, it would probably not end up that way. They would probably have partitioned it further. That's why you get the whole concept of Burgundy in alternate scenarios. Or maybe it would have just been returned because the Germans at this point would have to be garrisoning all of Russia, all of the Balkans, and all of this. Now we are left with the situation where France has collapsed. This comes as a shocker to everybody because the Germans had just destroyed Poland, Denmark, Norway, all the Benelux, now France. Now imagine you are a guy in Britain and you see all this happening, you're like, oh damn, I'm next. The thing is, Germans had zero capacity to even invade the British Isles. This was because the German Navy was horrible. They didn't even have enough ships to carry men to there. Now some people are arguing that, oh, you know, they should have just sent paratroopers. I'm not even gonna listen to those arguments. So now we're left with, okay, one thing I forgot to draw was the Spanish Civil War. So we're going to temporarily take a break from this. So the Spanish Civil War, it ended in around 1941, 1940, because that was the last Madrid resistance. So there was Republican resistance for a while. And it didn't end towards 1939 to 1941. The Nationalists won the Civil War against the Republicans. So, I mean, there's no point in drawing it now, but at this point they had won. So Francisco Franco had won. Now we're going to return to the Balkans. Now the famous Balkans, let me just do stuff here. There we go. Just the islands here. So now we're left with a new situation here. So the Italians decide, while all of this is going on, they decide to annex Albania. Now with the fall of France, the Italians decide, by the way, I'm drawing this, but they hadn't taken it until the annexation of Vichy France. So, but I'm drawing it because it's about to happen. So the Italians annex Albania, so the famous invasion of Albania, which, I mean, probably the only success the Italians had. Then after this, we have the famous invasion of Greece. But before this happens, actually no, this is after. Okay, so the Italians invade Greece, they push slightly. So the Italians push slightly, but then the Greeks regroup and they counterattack until they push back the Italians up to here. Now, let's be honest, Greece probably would have won the war, but what happens is the Germans decide to demand Yugoslavia's entry into the Axis. Yugoslavia at first accepts, but then a coup d'etat happens, and what happens is those guys immediately leave. But the thing is, they didn't want to join the Allies, they just wanted to stay neutral. But Mustache Man sees this as a threat, because how dare they? So what happens is they all invade Yugoslavia, so they all jump them. So Hungary joins in, Romania technically joins in, well, they just joined the Axis, and Bulgaria also. But before Romania even joins, the USSR demands that they give them Bessarabia. So So with the surrender of Bessarabia, which is this region, aka Moldova, they lose this region. We're not gonna really erase it, but regardless, we're going to partition Romania after. So what happens is they all jump Yugoslavia. So then we have the Italian occupation here. Honestly, I'm not even gonna draw the invasion of Yugoslavia. They collapsed very quickly. I think 2 days or 1 week. It was really the quickest invasion because all the Axis was, focused on it. Then you had the Hungarian annexation here, the German annexation, Italian occupation, and this was Slovenia, so the partition of Slovenia, the Vojvodina, and this small strip of land that the Hungarians took from there. And then you have the little German Banat that was here. Now, the next thing is, right as Yugoslavia was getting invaded, Bulgaria allowed German troops to also invade Greece at the same time. So after this, the Greeks were pushed out of Albania, and we're now going to draw the partition of Yugoslavia. So the Bulgarians take this. The Germans occupy the border here with Turkey. The Greek army collapses, and also British forces from North Africa come to Greece to try and defend them. Doesn't work. The Germans occupy this region, Italians technically occupy this region, and eventually right after this, after the collapse of the British forces, the Germans decide to do the Battle of Crete. So they send paratroopers to Crete. Although it was a success, it was a massive failure in terms of losses. Honestly, if it were up to me, I would have probably sent the paratroopers to Malta instead of Crete, because Crete would have fallen regardless. It's very easy to take it compared to Malta, and Malta could have fallen in real life. In fact, Italian plans were actually crazy. It was probably one of the most planned invasions, and if you actually look at the Italian plans, they were actually pretty decent for Italy, and they actually had the resources to do it, but they never did it because of the Crete failure. So with the fall of Crete, which came at massive losses, hold on, now we're just going to draw Kosovo, well, the Italian annexation. We're going to draw Montenegro, then we're going to draw the independent state of Croatia, aka the state of war crimes, the Italian annexation of Dalmatia, right? And now we have, well, the Balkans divided. Now, this was not the final changes to the Balkans. Another thing comes along, and it's the Treaty of Vienna, which is the partition of Romania. So Bulgaria takes northern Dobruja, or southern Dobruja. Then Hungary decides to take northern Transylvania, right, which looks like this. Now, I don't know if this is true. I keep seeing this somewhere, but apparently the Germans had given this to Hungary. But in real life, I think that I saw somewhere that after World War II, if they had won, they would have let Romania re-invade Hungary. Now, I don't know if that's true or if that's something that came along at the end of the war, where, because of Hungary being less supportive of the war, they might have considered that. I'm not sure, but honestly, I would think that it's true. Also, while all this is going on, in 1939-1940, the Turks annexed Hatay. So they demanded they do a referendum, and the French government accepts. And now we are left with, well, pre-Barbarossa borders. So all of this has been divided. And while this is all going on, there's also the North Africa campaign, which really starts to happen in 1942 around, because now Italy's in the war, but due to their incompetence, they don't do much in Africa. And also, mind you, in North Africa, well, Libya, there's only one railroad. And even though it has one railroad, Libya has a population of around, I think, 200 to 400,000. Now you're saying, what's the relevance? The relevance is Egypt had a population from 1 to 10 million. So Libya cannot sustain so many forces in its borders because, one, the British would probably be blockading, so the Italians can't send enough supplies. And the local population can't supply all of these troops at the same time while sustaining themselves. And that's one of the main reasons why Italy was unable to push anywhere. Now, while all this is going on, the USSR also annexes the Baltics, and they begin the famous Winter War. Now, the Winter War, as humiliating as it is for the Russians, if it had continued, Finland would have definitely been destroyed. The reason why it didn't continue is because it was humiliating for Stalin. And also, the Finns had been offering peace treaty. So eventually this happens, the Finns surrender, and they lose this region, and it gives Leningrad a better defensible position. But at the same time, the initial goal of the war was to give Stalin a better defensible border in case the Finns invade. Now, a question that I would ask is, would Finland have invaded Russia had Russia not invaded them? Now, that's a good question, but at the same time, if they had not invaded and the Finns invaded, Leningrad would have most likely fallen. Right? So at the same time, they did do what they were supposed to do. It was kind of justified if you think about it. Now, we are left with, well, everything has been partitioned. And at this situation of the war, although you might think Germany is very powerful, Germany was running out of resources very fast. In fact, they had, by some estimates, 1 year left of oil. So at the start of the invasion of Russia, Germany had 1 year left of oil and resources. Because you must understand, when I say oil, 1 year of oil left, I'm not just saying for the German army. I'm also saying that Germany has to maintain its occupations. Now, just because they're being blockaded doesn't mean that you're just thinking about their army. You must also think about the population itself. So what did Germany do? They took all of their resources from the occupations towards, well, Germany itself. And hence the war economy term. Germany has had a war economy for years, since the beginning of 1933 till now. The reason why they marched into the Rhineland, the Saarland, Austria immediately sacked all Austrian banks. Czechoslovakia, they looted the entire stockpile. All of the finances that Czechoslovakia had, and the invasion of Poland. In fact, if Germany had not invaded, it's most likely that Mustache Man's regime would have collapsed because they could not supply themselves anymore. You can't hide behind bills. And hence, the invasion of Russia begins. Now, to make it clear, I'm going to erase the SSRs because then you'll be confused. So we're just going to erase all of the little, autonomous puppet zones. No, they weren't really autonomous at all. And now we have the invasion of Russia under 3 army groups. So you have Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South. So they invade. Army Group North invades here. Army Group Center at the center, and Army Group South invades here. Now, all of these invasions, the Army Group North first reaches over here, and they cross the river. They cross the river by chance and also speed. Had they not crossed it, it would have most likely led to the Germans being halted, but them crossing allowed the German forces to eventually push here. In real life, the Germans were not expecting to cross so quickly. In fact, they were probably estimating that they would have to conquer the river, then cross it. But they crossed it. Now, Army Group Center had pushed here, and they slowly approached Kiev, and then Army Group South had reached all the way here towards modern-day Odessa. Odessa was under siege, and this was the front line in a few weeks, including a few encirclements. One of the main encirclements being Army Group, the Russian center, where eventually the Army Group North decides to come back down before going back north. Some say that if Germany had decided not to do that, they could have captured Moscow. Now, I'm thinking, yes, they would have, but at the same time, I also think that it would have been stupid because at the same time, a mustache man was the guy who decided to lead the forces back south because he thought that destroying the Russian army would mean that afterwards it would be much more free to push. That's the logical answer, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but if I was a general, I would have probably done the same as him, because the main goal is to crush the Russian army here. And this is exactly what happened. The Russians, the Army Group North and Army Group Center and Army Group South all combine forces and they encircle the Russian forces here. And eventually it leads to the borders of the famous Barbarossa borders, which is this. Around half of the Russian forces, well, not half, around 300 to 800,000 Russian forces were captured, and alongside this, most of the Baltics were captured, and eventually they lead to the siege of Leningrad, the encirclement of Leningrad, and also Finland had joined the war, and we lead to the encirclement of most of the Russian forces, and eventually the beginning of the winter. Also, mind you, Rasputitsa also exists. So now, hold on, let's take a moment to really show what the front lines really look like. Something we're ignoring is that the Russian forces are actually much more inwards. And this comes to the famous 1941 Barbarossa borders. So now that we're here, we can understand that there was an encirclement here, Kiev was also encircled, encirclement there, encirclement in Odessa and in the north, which, by the way, almost 3 years later, the Germans were encircled the same way they encircled the Russians. And this leads to both sides settling in for the winter. The Moscow was right here, by the way, around here. The Germans had thought, we're just going to show the Battle of Moscow. The Germans had begun pushing, so they began going like this. They tried to encircle the city, like this. And this was pre-Soviet counteroffensive. So the city was almost encircled. One of the reasons it never did is because, one, winter, and also two, their lines were too overstretched. So the German tank divisions were too overstretched. They needed to wait for infantry, and because of that, Russian forces were able to come back and repel. It was one of the first successful Soviet counteroffensives before the Great Counteroffensive. What happens is now winter comes along, and what happens is the Russians counterattack and the Germans are pushed back. And they're basically pushed back to their original positions. And also a possible encirclement happened here. The Germans were actually encircled in an area. And by the way, this is where the Germans had gotten the inspiration of when they later on get encircled in Stalingrad, of the idea of, yeah, we're going to supply it with only planes. Because that one small encirclement was actually being supplied by planes, and it worked until the Germans break it out. And the Germans had expected to do the same in Stalingrad. Now, I know that at the beginning of the video, I said that I would do from 1938 to 1941, but I feel like we should go all the way to 1945. Now, we are faced with this situation for the Germans, and by now, the Germans were running out of oil, they were running out of supplies, and also, mind you, the reason why Germany could not use a lot of trains is because they had to remake the tracks, and every time they had to transition from their German trains to Russian train, because the tracks are different. And because of that, a lot of trains could not go all the way, and they needed to be transferred. Also, I'm going to expand the borders of the general government. Poland now own this. Then you had Ukraine, which for now own this. Then you have Romania, who owned Bessarabia, and technically eventually Odessa, but honestly, did they really own it? Technically, you could say that Romania owned this, but depends on who really occupied it. It was really the Germans. Then you had the Reich Commissariat Ostland, which looked like that. And now we are faced with a few months of doing nothing, and eventually the Germans decide we need to start pushing again. And Mustache Man decides, instead of focusing all their efforts this time on Moscow, to focus all their efforts this time on Stalingrad and the Baku oil fields. Now, he had two intentions in mind. One, to capture Stalingrad and deliver a strategic blow to the morale of the Red Army, and also to capture the oil field in the south. And this is what happens. So the Germans begin pushing. They push towards Moscow. And at the same time, while pushing, he decides to focus all the German forces here, and he trusts his allies to defend his flanks. So the Hungarians and Romanians and Italians. By the way, famous fact, one of the last major cavalry battles were actually in this area, and it was by the Italians with the Russian army. So the Italians decided to use their horses against Russian tanks. And you can kind of expect what happened. So the entire Italian army was crushed alongside the Hungarian and Romanian armies eventually when they got encircled. So there we go. You have the banks of Stalingrad. And also, mind you, the Germans had actually reached the Caspian. They actually reached Astrakhan, but they were repelled. But for this video, I will not show them owning this. Eventually, they reached the Caucasian Mountains, and it was basically looking like this. By the way, if you don't know, there's actually oil fields in this area. So technically, he did capture some oil fields, if you think about it, but not enough. So we're faced with this situation. They had pushed all this way, and they had finally gotten almost close to their goal. Now this is where you see the famous peak videos of the Germans during World War II. This was their peak, and then eventually, by the way, due to Italian losses in Africa, and due to the French losing Syria because of Iraq turning Golden Square and then getting invaded, the Germans decided to annex France completely. But they were unable to capture their fleet because their fleet was actually destroyed by the British. And eventually you have, well, an entire occupation of France. And, hold on, I forgot the Journey Islands, or the Gurney Islands. By the way, France had actually, a lot of the French industry was helpful to the Germans during World War II. A lot of bad stuff happened there. I mean, honestly, any occupied territory under the Germans. But the issue is that the French collaborators helped a lot in this, especially Petain's government. You would think that he was an actual, just a puppet, right? He was just placed in power for that. But no, Pétain actually believed in a lot of the ideals that the Germans had. And that's one of the main reasons why he got killed in the end. Well, I think they let him live because he was old, but regardless. And then the borders of the Reichskommissariat expand. Ukraine looks like this now. A bunch of war crimes, partisans appear all around. I could draw them. At the same time, the Chetniks, Tito's army are all coming out in the Balkans. A huge mess, and eventually he leads to their liberation. Now, here comes the famous fact. The Germans capture most of Stalingrad, except for the East Bank, because there's an Eastern Bank. And eventually the Russians decide to launch Operation Uranus. And this leads to the Russians pushing here, here, and mostly here. And this operation, by the way, the Russians weren't expecting it to succeed so well, especially. But due to the fact that you can't trust Hungarians, Italians, and Romanians to defend your flanks. I don't know why they did that, but the German forces were overstretched. And honestly, even if there were German forces, there would not have been enough to hold them back. And this leads to the encirclement of Stalingrad, well, the German side of Stalingrad, and also significant pushes here, significant push here. Eventually the Germans decide to completely withdraw to Crimea and Ukraine. Huge humiliation for the German forces. Around the entire 6th Army was encircled. Friedrich Paulus was captured at the end. A lot of famous movies come from this area. From the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans were unable to resist, and this leads to the collapse of the entire 6th Army and the entire collapse of the Ukrainian front. So the Germans are forced to pull back to here, or they were pushed back. They lose all of the Caucasus. Stalingrad eventually surrenders, and you're back to this situation here. Now, after this situation, the Russians decide to launch a great offensive. This offensive managed to take a lot of territory, but it halts at Kharkiv. So the Russians capture Kharkiv, but this capture of Kharkiv is temporary. What happens is a guy named Erich von Manstein decides to launch a counteroffensive near Kharkiv, and this is the prelude to the Battle of Kursk. So this is the situation now. At the same time that this is happening, the Allies capture most of it of North Africa, and they begin the preparations to invade Sicily. So while before the Battle of Kursk, there's the Battle of Kharkiv. So the Germans launch a significant counteroffensive where they manage to retake Kharkiv temporarily, and this forces the Russians to halt. And while this happens, the Germans also push in the north, which causes this significant bulge to arise near Kursk. Now, if you were a Russian general, you could decide to do another great offensive where the German forces are still alive, so you would suffer significant losses. I mean, you could push, but you would suffer significant losses to the point where the Germans can regroup and retaliate. Or, since the British are feeding you information, you have a bunch of intelligence, and you know that the Germans are building up here. What happens is the Russians start to build up in the Kursk area. So they know that the Germans were about to invade, are about to try to encircle them in Kursk. So they build up a bunch of defenses, and the Germans begin their offensive and Operation Typhoon. They break through a bunch of lines, but it was not successful enough, and the entire German tank army, well, not the entire, but most of the German tank army was there, a lot of Russian tanks too, and the biggest tank battle, famous. But the Germans are eventually halted, and because of this, the Russians begin a counterattack, and since the Germans were depleted, boom, that was it. That was it for the Germans. They get pushed back from Kursk, and also Kharkiv, and this leads to eventually the downfall of the Germans, and also Crimea falls eventually. And now you are faced with this situation while the Allies have now landed in Italy. The Italian government decides to switch sides, and eventually they enter a civil war on Yemen. So the Italian Social Republic is declared, the Germans occupy it, while the Germans enter and occupy. And now you are faced with, if you were a German general, the downfall situation. Now, a lot of people might say this was still savable. I'm going to be honest, no, unless you're playing Hearts of Iron 4, then it might be savable, because it's a game. This is not a game though. What happened is the German army was basically depleted, and even if the Germans had started building fortifications here, maybe they would have held back the Russians for a while, but eventually we know what happens in France, we know what happens in southern France, Italy. At this point you have a front here, and then eventually another front here, and then there's another front here. Let's be honest, you're kind of screwed. You're no longer in two-front war, you're in a three-front war. In fact, a four-front war if you consider Operation Dragoon another front, but eventually it becomes three fronts. Still, you're kind of screwed. And if you consider Tito's partisans as another front, that's 4 fronts. Now, this is where the German generals start to stress. So now we're just gonna erase the puppet states. We're just gonna draw the occupation. By the way, I just realized I forgot something. I forgot to draw the annexation of Białystok. Sorry for that. And now we're left with this situation. The siege of Leningrad is broken. The Germans are pushed back all the way to Estonia. And eventually this leads to the Great Russian Offensive around 1943-1944. So this is the beginning of the actual downfall. The Germans are forced to push back here, so all of Ukraine falls to the Russians. And now the Russians had finally reached the Romanian border, so Bessarabia. The Germans were in this situation, and now this was their front. They had lost all their gains, well, almost all their gains except for Ostland. The Romanians were now bordering the Russians. Hungary was also bordering the Russians. Romania doesn't switch sides immediately. In fact, they took a while before they did, and it was when the Russians broke through Bessarabia and got closer to Bucharest. And they did that for a good reason, and that's, well, they thought that they would keep their monarchy if they switched sides, or at least their state. That didn't happen. And it was the king of Romania who did a coup in order to save his people, which, it was a wise decision. So now we're faced with this situation. The Russians decide to launch the great Operation Bagration, where the German forces are encircled in Kurland, and the entire German North Army is now cut off from the rest. And the German army in the center, which had been depleted due to Kursk, had been completely destroyed. And the German the Southern Army was basically wiped out after Stalingrad and all of the offensives that had been building up since then. While this happens, the Normandy landings happen. Operation Dragoon happens way later on, so we're just going to draw Operation Dragoon. The campaign in Italy continues. It's grueling. Eventually Rome falls. Albert Kesselring is able to hold them back for now. And this is the situation so far. Right? If I were Germany, I would have probably surrendered, but listen, I don't control history. So now let's draw the updated borders. Estonia had fallen, Latvia had fallen, German forces were in Kurland. The Great Polish Uprising happens in here. Polish partisans all rise up. The Russians decide as they're invading Poland, so they approached here. As they're invading, they decide to wait until the Germans wipe them out, while they reach the Vistula. They wait until the Germans wipe out their partisans. Now we're just gonna erase. Not erase, but we're gonna temporarily erase these Polish borders, so we can build up for the next front. So now we're faced with this situation here. This was the German occupation of Poland. The Russians waited until the Germans crushed the Warsaw Uprising. While this happens, the liberation of France begins. So the liberation of Paris. This was the front line. They all connected together, and there was a bunch of German outposts and festoons that were all around the place. So this happens, and France had fallen. Well, France had been liberated. As soon as the Warsaw Uprising was done, the Russian forces captured, and they begin pushing deep. East Prussia, well, Königsberg is encircled, but Königsberg managed to survive most of the war, eventually until Operation Hannibal, where the Germans try and evacuate their forces back to this situation here. While this happens, the Russians are also able to switch, force the Romanians to switch sides after the fall of Bessarabia and the arrival to Bucharest. Soon afterwards, the Germans decide to try and occupy, they occupy the north here, and they try to hold them back in the Transylvanian mountains. This fails miserably. As this happens, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, decide to switch sides. So we're going to draw this situation here. So as the Bulgarians are switching sides, we're just going to draw back the old borders. And now, with the fall of Bulgaria after switching sides, they were also allowed to keep southern Dobruja. As this happens, Tito's partisans managed to liberate most of the south. Greece is finally liberated. The partisans of Tito managed to liberate most of the Balkans, or most of the south. The independent state of Croatia manages to resist, although a lot of it has been occupied. But they managed to survive for a little bit. So then you have Yugoslavia under Tito's partisans managing to survive. But now, before the Russians managed to pulverize the German forces that were remaining here, which happens eventually, the Russians decide to focus on the Balkans for a while at the same time. So we're going to take a break from this front. The Russians managed to push back the Germans all the way, or the Hungarians, all the way here. And while this happens, all the way to the, by the way, Germany still occupies Budapest, all the way here. So by this point, Hungary had ceased to exist. Well, not ceased to exist, they were just occupied. So I'm just going to draw the Hungarian borders. Carpathia Ruthenia was liberated. Vojvodina had fallen. The Serbs were back. Well, Yugoslavia was back. And now we're faced with the poorest situation that the Germans have been in. And Hungary had tried to switch sides, but the Germans had launched a coup. They took back Budapest, and eventually the Russians take back Budapest, or they take Budapest, and they begin an offensive here. And this leads to the last major German offensive in the south. And this offensive, if it had succeeded, would have been the last major German encirclement of Russian forces they had tried. So the spring offensive. This failed miserably because German forces were not enough. Some argue that Germany should have never launched it and sent those tanks to the north to try and defend Berlin. It wouldn't have changed anything. So eventually this whole region becomes a stalemate. The Slovakians are slowly occupied, and now the big push to Berlin begins. So the Germans and the Russians manage to reach the actual Pomeranian borders. They lead to the encirclement of Breslau. They take over Pomerania, they cross the Elbe, the Oder River. Breslau was encircled, sorry. And this was the German situation by this point. And now, I kind of forgot one front, which is the Battle of the Bulge. So we're going to come back here. So the Germans in the east and the west were now being pushed back all the way. So now they had lost all this. They were now in this situation. They had lost Belgium. They had lost the Netherlands, basically. And this was their situation. The Germans decide one last offensive. By the way, I'm showing the Bulge offensive, but they had not been in this situation when this happened. They still owned parts of Poland. The Bulge offensive begins, and they managed to reach most of their objectives. One of the issues was that they ran out of oil, and the offensive failed miserably. And also there was this one American division that refused to surrender, and because it refused to surrender, Germany could not reach all of its goals. Now we're faced with this situation. Then the British attempt a miserable paratrooper landing in the Netherlands. It fails miserably. The Germans resist. And now you're faced with Endsieg, the final, what Germany thought it was the final victory. So, they thought that they would win in the end. And this was just a slow, agonizing death for the Germans. Hungary was liberated. More like new management. Slovakia had collapsed. Czechoslovakia was restored. The Czechs, by the way, were not liberated until the end of the war. The Germans had kept it. Vienna would fall eventually. All of Croatia, Montenegro, all of these states would be liberated by the Yugoslav partisans. And this leads to the end of World War II eventually. By the way, the Germans would annex this part of Italy. And this is where the infamous downfall, if you watched Downfall movie, you will see that this is the end situation of the German forces by this point. The American forces had continued their offensive here. They encircled the Ruhr Pocket. Sorry, my tongue is rolling. So they encircled the German army in the Ruhr, and the Russian forces kept their offensive until Berlin. They reached here. Silesia had completely fallen by this point. Operation Hannibal, German forces are evacuated, although it's mostly by the way, the Kurland pocket still lives. And now let's draw Berlin. American forces to the west, Russian forces to the east, and by this point you can kind of expect what's happening. The American forces continue their offensives. They lead all the way here. The famous battle of the Silo Heights begins. Most of Italy is liberated. Mussolini is hanged before even Mustache Man dies. So the Russians launch the encirclement of Berlin. So they encircle the city. So now that the city is encircled, alongside the Potsdam oil fields being captured, at this point you can kind of expect what happens to the Germans. It's unsavable. Even Steiner could not save this. Vienna had been captured. Europe was on the brinks of liberation. So we're just going to leave it here. Now, this is probably my biggest video so far. Although I did not draw Europe, I feel like it's mostly just for information. I don't know whether or not I should keep doing videos like this. I'm kind of experimenting. In this video, I'm mostly cold face because I'm trying to see what succeeds the best. By this point, this was April for the German forces. They were completely done, and they had surrendered eventually. So they went from owning almost all of Europe to ending up like Lotharingia between East and West Francia. It's embarrassing. I mean, how can you fail so miserably? I would never be in that situation, personally. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this. Do suggest whatever you want to see different. I mean, maybe a lack of energy, maybe a different type of map. Otherwise, thank you, and thank you for watching. And I hope to see you guys soon.